as a knowledge management officer in Diamond. I will be talking to you today about the best practices and principles in data visualization. So let me share my screen.
So interesting.
And I'll ask those of you to mute yourself. Thank you. Let's see. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. I can see from here.
Yes, we
Can see.
can.
Okay, so let me just start with a couple of definitions. They'll become clearer as we go along in the presentation, but just to sort of lay the ground. Data visualization is the practice of visually representing data or information, usually to simplify its understanding. A chart is a graphical representation in which the data is represented by symbols, and graphs, maps, and diagrams are usually subtypes, and an infographic is a visual representation of information or data, usually combining different types of charts and text. This is the very first historical example of what we consider to be
Thank you.
modern type of data visualization. So this is a map of human losses during the Napoleonic Russia campaign of 1812. And we'll get back to this chart at the end of the presentation, but just to quickly summarize it, what you can see in this chart is essentially human losses as the military campaign went on. So there's different layers of information that are combined together. We have time. The campaign starts on the left. It goes all the way to Moscow on the right, and then it comes back. We have some geographical components. We have some temperature elements at the bottom, and we have some textual information. So I just wanted to quickly introduce this chart, but we'll get back to it at the end of the presentation. Why do we care about data visualization? There's a handful of good reasons. First of all, good data visualization can boost engagement by capturing the attention of your audience. It can improve analysis by making it easier to see trends, to predict outcomes, to identify relationships. It can save time by avoiding for the reader to do the math when they look at the raw data. And it can reduce cognitive load. So cognitive load is essentially the amount of mental strain that you have to go through when you're processing information. So typically, if you look at raw data, or if you go through a lengthy paper, this will require a lot of cognitive load. One way to provide a shortcut to your audience is by providing a good data visualization to essentially summarize the insights that you want them to walk away with. And finally, data visualization is a good way to tell a story, and I'll expand on this in a second. I just wanted also to give a quick primer on the data value chain. So these are the different steps that are typically involved when it comes to collecting, producing, and using data. So the first stage has to do with collection. So you identify what kind of data you're trying to collect. Then you figure out how you want to collect it, how you want to process it. Do you clean it? Do you upload it in CSV format, etc.? Once you're through with the collection stage, there's usually a publication stage where first you need to analyze the data you collected, and then you release it, and then you disseminate it. And then there's an uptake stage where you usually connect, incentivize, and influence your audience using your data. And then at the end of this value chain, you have the impact stage where the data is used and it leads to change, and then it also can be reused. You'll see in yellow, there's a continuous feedback loop with different stakeholders that are involved in the data value chain. That will inform the various stages of this process. And as we go from production to use, from left to right, usually the value of data increases. So at the very beginning, when you're identifying and collecting it, it's still in raw format. And by the end of the value chain, when the data is used, is influencing, it's leading to change, this is when you have the most value. So this is a good cycle to keep in mind, because obviously the data value chain is quite large, and when you choose which stage you are trying to visualize, you need to keep in mind what are the goals that you're trying to reach. Are you trying to inform your audience about how the data was collected, or are you trying to disseminate a particular result? Are you trying to influence a particular set of actors? Or are you trying to maximize impact by leading to, for example, societal change? And depending on your goal, your data visualization method, your format, and so on will change accordingly. I also forgot to say, please don't hesitate to interrupt if you have any questions, but I'll also leave some time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. So I'm going to be focusing now on 3 pillars of data visualization best practices. The first one has to do with storytelling. The second one has to do with focusing attention. And the third one has to do with choosing the right visual. So storytelling. Storytelling is essentially an art form that's as old as humanity, or at least since we've developed language. It has a common structure. Every story that we tell usually consists of a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning provides context. It introduces the protagonists. It presents the unresolved state of affairs, and it outlines the desired outcome of the story. The middle typically addresses how to solve the problem. It illustrates the benefits of the proposed solutions, and it develops what could be in a more meaty manner, let's say. And then the end usually ties the story back to the beginning. It provides a resolution, and it convinces the audience for a need to action. These different elements of a story are important to keep in mind as you are producing your data visualization, because effectively what you're doing is you're telling a story. So you need to keep in mind, what is your narrative? What are you trying to convince the audience of? What is your overarching goal? And how can you, and what kind of data visualization can you produce to best serve these different purposes? I'll make a distinction at this stage between exploratory and explanatory analysis. So typically, if you remember the data value chain, there's a lot of different stages that come into play when we work with data. And there's usually a very large exploratory phase when you're sifting through your data. You're analyzing the different variables, you're finding various results that are not necessarily relevant to the end goal of the exercise. If you're focused on producing a particular output, you'll usually want to focus on the explanatory analysis. So this is when you sort of forget about all of the contextual processes, and you instead focus on the final result. So let's say if you're fishing for pearls and you have to go through 100 different oysters and you find a pearl at the very end, in the very last oyster, the exploratory analysis would be you talking about going through 99 oysters. The explanatory analysis would be you just showing that final pearl. Usually the audience only cares about the final most important result. So it's a good idea to keep that in mind as you're producing your data visualization, and focus on the main takeaway, on the main highlights of your research. However, sometimes you're trying to convince your audience about, let's say, the technical validity of your work, and that the research has been sound and has been conducted according to proper scientific principles and so on, in which case maybe you'll want to focus more on the exploratory side and explain the process, the thought process, and the research methods that you've used and so on. Now I'll be talking about a few principles that have to do with focusing attention and how the human brain works and processes information. So these principles were identified in the early 1900s in Germany and Austria by a school of thought called Gestalt. So I'll be talking about, I think, 6 different principles. The first one has to do with proximity, and it basically states that we think of objects that are physically close together as belonging in the same group. So, for example, if you have on the left side 3 different groupings, our brain will associate, even though the data points are the same, they look the same, they're the same size, we will assume that there's 3 different subgroups. If we arrange these dots by reducing the amount of space on a vertical level, we'll process the dots as columns, and we can also do the same thing by processing them as rows. So in each of these cases, in all 3 cases, the dots are identical. The only thing that changes is their proximity between them. So this is a good principle to keep in mind as you're producing your data. The second principle has to do with similarity. So we think of objects that are similar as belonging to the same group. So here we're using, for example, the use of color, the use of shapes, or the use of both proximity and color in order to identify, or in order to group the data points in different manners, right? So here we'll have 3 subgroupings, but within those subgroupings, we'll probably think of the blue dots as belonging to the same family, let's say. Same thing here, we're going to see crosses and squares before we see 3 different groups. And then here we're going to go across the rows. That's typically what we do when we go across tables. And so it's a good principle to keep in mind that similarity tends to supersede proximity. It usually matters more in our mind as we glance over the visual representation than proximity does. The third principle is called enclosure. So we think of objects that are enclosed together as part of a group, again, regardless of the other 2 principles that we saw before. If we fence off different data points together, we'll think of them as being part of the same group, even if they're closer to other ones. And we can use this principle by, for example, shading a part of the data representation that we're trying to highlight. Or if we're doing forecasting, then maybe it's a way to indicate that there's a before and after the enclosure limit. So the fourth principle is called closure, and this says that we tend to perceive a set of individual elements as a single recognizable shape when we can. So if you look on the left, our brain will process this as a circle, even though there's spaces in between the line segments. And the way that we can leverage this when we produce data visualization is by essentially decluttering. So if you look at the second and the third visual representations, it's the same graph, but the one on the right is much cleaner, and it reduces this cognitive load, this cognitive burden that I mentioned before. We can remove the enclosure, we can remove the shading, and we're essentially conveying the exact same information, but we're giving the viewer less clutter and less unnecessary detail. So we're conveying our point much faster and in a much more efficient way. The fifth principle is called continuity, and it describes our ability to see 2 well-defined overlapping figures instead of one larger one. So if you take the first shape, our mind assumes that if we separated those, we would obtain something like the second, even though it could just as well be the third. But our brain will sort of go through the lines and follow the smoothest path. And the way that you leverage this in data visualization is, again, by decluttering. So for example, here in this bar chart, you can remove the axis, and because we have an alignment, our eyes will naturally follow the smoothest path. And again, we're reducing the cognitive burden, and we're conveying the data visualization in a much more efficient way. So we have this vertical alignment between the columns and the letter, and we have a horizontal alignment between each letter and each bar. So our brain naturally knows that A is the largest value and E is the smallest one. And finally, the sixth principle that I'll cover today is called connection. And this says that we tend to think of objects that are physically connected as part of the same group. And so this will supersede all of the other principles that we saw before. So regardless of the color, regardless of the size, regardless of the shape, regardless of the enclosure, if we have a connecting element between two sub-elements, then our brains will perceive this as being part of the stronger group, let's say. Now I'll talk about pre-attentive attributes. So pre-attentive attributes are things like size, like color, and position on a page. And essentially you want to be aware of them in order to direct your audience's attention and create a visual hierarchy. So the first one is orientation. If you have a bunch of lines that are facing the same way and you rotate one, this will immediately draw attention to it. You can use shape in a similar way, line length, line width. Essentially, all of these elements, they break the continuity of an already established pattern that's on the page. And we also have some innate assumptions about some of these attributes. So for example, if you look at the line width in the upper right, the thicker bar will assume has a stronger value, a larger value compared to the rest. You can use color. I'll talk about color a little bit more in detail later, but you can use hue and intensity to make a certain data point stand out. You can use spatial position, and you can also use motion. So we're used in the at least Western system to read from left to right. So that's usually how we go through a page. We'll start at the top left, and then we'll sort of zigzag across and usually finish in the bottom right. So you want to use these pre-attentive attributes to, again, just like direct the audience of your, sorry, the attention of your audience. And you want to be mindful about which attribute is stronger than the others. Now I'll talk about choosing the right visual. So data visualization can be a little bit overwhelming in that there are millions of ways of representing the same information. So I'm just going to, I can't cover everything, but I'll try to go over the main categories of different visualizations that you can use, which are typically the ones that you'll see most often. Let me just say, in terms of what software to use, whether to use Tableau, Power BI, or Excel, etc., I would say the best software to use is the one that you already know. If you want to pick up a new one, one that I particularly like is called Flourish, and it's very easy to use. You basically only need Excel skills. So maybe if there's time at the end, I'll go back and show you what the website actually looks like. But this is just a note to say that all of the visuals that you're going to see were made on Flourish. And it's really not technically difficult compared to, say, Power BI or Tableau, which I think have a bit of a steeper learning curve. So yeah, I'll just get back to this at the end of the presentation if there's time. I just wanted to start with a mock data set. So imagine that we have income per capita in 3 different countries, country A, country B, country C, and we want to focus this analysis on country C. So we're going to use a color that stands out compared to the other two. So we're going to pick the color blue, and we're going to have black and gray, which are more muted color, to sort of draw attention to the country that we're interested in. Now, if you have the data in a table format, it's kind of hard to make sense of the information. So it's a little bit like what we said at the beginning. You kind of have to do a lot of math. You need to look at the numbers. You need to pick out the trends. And it's not the easiest way to go about it. There's a very high cognitive burden that is placed on the viewer, right? So one very simple way of graphically or visually representing a subset of that information is by simply using text. You can make your text big and bold and colorful and draw attention to a particular part of your data. So here, for example, we chose to highlight the income per capita in 2020, and we see that country A has $42,500 per capita, country B has 32,000.5 and country C has 22.5. So compared to the table, we're already processing a lot of the information, right? And we're highlighting a subset of the data. However, we're also missing a lot of information. That's usually the problem with text. It's really good to focus attention, but you're kind of missing the big picture that could otherwise be conveyed through your data visualization. So one good first reflex to have is to use what's called a scatter plot, which is essentially just representing the data in the form of dots. So again, we have country C in blue that we're interested in. We have the income per capita on the y-axis and the years on the x-axis. I'll mention here that the elements that you want to always have in a graph are quite straightforward, but very important. Essentially, you want to have your axes clearly labeled. So here we see that the years are at the bottom, income per capita is on the Y. You want to make sure that the format of your data is clear. So we can see here that we're talking about dollars. And you want to make sure that there's some kind of legend or labeling so that you know which series belongs to what category. And then, of course, you want to have a title so that the chart is self-explanatory. You want to avoid for your audience to need to go back in the text to understand what it is that they're looking at. So the mock data sets that we visualize in a scatter plot, essentially what we can see is that there's been a steep drop between 2016 and 2017 in the country that we're interested in, right? So imagine this drop could be caused by a variety of factors. It could be conflict, it could be an economic crisis, it could be a health crisis. But what this data visualization tells us very quickly, which the table didn't, is that something happened in this year that only affected country C, and that did not seem to affect country A and B. And if you look at the table, again, this is the exact same information, but just seeing it a bunch of numbers, this relationship will be much harder to pick out. But it's actually here. If you spend enough time, you'll see that we go from 29,000 to 20,000. So this is the 10K drop that we're seeing here on the chart. If we think about the visual principles that we saw earlier, one thing that we can do with the scatter plot is to just connect the dots, right? And create some lines instead, which will emphasize the drop, which will emphasize the trends that we just talked about. Instead of labeling using a legend, instead here I put the labels directly on the lines. This is another way to go about it. And one thing to keep in mind if you're using a line graph, it's usually a good idea to start from 0, because if not, it can lead to confusion, or it can be a little bit intellectually dishonest. We'll talk a little bit about how data can be used to serve a particular purpose. But if you want to sort of do it by the guidebook, it's generally a good idea to start your axes at 0. So again, this is the exact same data that's represented now in columns. And I just wanted to make a point about how you group your information can also have a very big impact on the speed at which you process it in your mind, right? So on the left, we have the column graph, which is split by year, and each year will have the 3 different countries. On the right, we have the exact same graph, the exact same information, but instead we split the columns in the 3 different countries. It's usually easier in this case to go with the second type of representation. Even though they're both as valid, even though they're both showing the same information, we can see on the right much more clearly that country C is at a, let's say, closer level to country B in terms of the income per capita, whereas country A has kind of always been richer, and we can also see that 10K drop that we talked about earlier. We can also, if we're interested in seeing the overall level of income, we can stack the columns. And I just wanted to make the point that if you can make your graph cleaner, again, with this idea of decluttering, it's usually a good idea. The representation will be usually smoother and usually more harmonious. So if you're going for a stacked column type of graph, often it's a good idea to convert it instead in an area graph, again, conveying the same information. And again, here we'll see this drop, usually in a much more, in an easier way compared to if we're just like stacking the columns like on the left.
Marco, so sorry to interrupt you. Stephen raised his hand, so he might have a question.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, I can't see the hand, so by all means, please feel free to jump in.
Stephen? Stephen, if you have a question, we'd be very happy to hear it, please.
Maybe we can come back to it at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving to another data set, I just wanted to introduce slope graphs that I think are quite useful and relatively underused. So the data set underlying this visualization is a questionnaire that was sent to residents of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where public authorities essentially led a series of roadwork, of construction on the road network in the city. And people were asked about the changes in their average commuting time. So the construction happened in 2018, 2019, and people were asked the same question in 2018 and 2020. And here we're using and I'll touch on this particular point in a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that we're using color in a strategic way. So we're interested in the people who spend less than 30 minutes commuting and those who spend more than 2 hours. And so for these two categories, we're using bolder colors compared to the other categories that are in the middle in a lighter gray. And we see with the slope graph that the people who spend less than 30 minutes, the share of respondents went from 50% to 12%. And the people who spend more than 2 hours commuting went from 3% to 17%. So this is the share of respondents and the evolution over time. One way of representing this exact same information, which is, I don't want to say intellectually dishonest, but maybe a little bit more intense, is to, instead of representing the evolution and share of respondents, is to represent the percentage change. So if you look at the previous graph, from going from 3% to 17%, another way of saying this is that there's been a 500% increase in the share of respondents that spend more than 2 hours commuting, and there's been a 75% decrease in those who spend less than 30 minutes. So the first type of graph, I would say, is maybe a little bit more objective. The second type of graph is more subjective. Let's say if you're really trying to make a case, like you're arguing a particular position, then you can say, like there's been a 500% increase. This is just something to keep in mind as you are building your data visualizations and presenting your work and your arguments, but also as you see other people's data visualizations. It's always a good idea to see if you have access to the base level of information, or if you're just looking at percentage changes or incomplete axis graph and so on and so forth. Just try to be aware of the fact that data can be not necessarily manipulated, although that's also the case, but just toyed with in a way to prove a point that might be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more nuanced if it was presented in a different way. So it's important to sort of train your critical reasoning skills as you are processing information. I'll touch briefly on color theory. So up until now, most of the colors that we've seen were fairly muted. But of course, there's more than 2 or 3 colors. There's a wide range out there. It's usually subdivided in hues, tints, tones, and shades. So color is sort of the general umbrella term for all of these. A hue refers to the dominant color family. So when we think of red, green, yellow, orange, blue, etc., we're usually referring to hues. A tint is also called a pastel, and it's a hue with only white added. So this is the second wheel that we see. It's just a lighter color wheel. A tone is a hue with only gray added, and a shade is a hue with only black added. So when you have, typically when you can choose a color using, those squares where you have all of the colors of the rainbow, when you're moving in a specific direction, up, down, left to right or center, etc., you're usually either adding gray, adding or removing gray, adding or removing white, or adding or removing black. This is important when you are picking different colors for your data visualization products. Usually you want to try and stay in the same family of tints or tones or shades, unless you have a specific reason not to do so. So for example, in this graph that we just saw, we see that this has a lot more white compared to those two which are bolder, because we're trying to emphasize these two categories, right? If the information that you're showing, you want to keep it on the same level, it's usually a good it's usually a good idea to stay within the same color family of tints, tones, and shades. Colors are often presented on a wheel. So the two most common types of wheel are the RGB and the CMY wheels. The point I'm trying to make here is that there's usually a harmonious way of selecting colors. So let's say if you pick a color blue and you want to have just one other color, it's often a good idea to go for a color that's on the other side of the wheel, because it will have the most contrast. If you have 3 colors, it could be a good idea to pick colors that are close. This is called the analogous combination. Or if you want to instead maximize the contrast between the 3 colors, you can go for what's called a triadic combination. If you don't go with those kind of combinations, of course you can, but usually what's going to happen is that you're making a non-strategic use of contrast. So for example, if you take this graph where we have our business in a blue little losange, in a blue little square, and you have different competitors, and you have these different categories like selection, convenience, service, relationship, price. The colors here are confusing, right? It's hard to make out who is where and what is the relationship between them, and there's just a bunch of different colors and shapes that are not necessarily making use of the contrast. So instead, you might want to ask, is it necessary to have all of these colors and to have all of these shapes in the first place? Let's say you're interested particularly in how your business compares to the other competitors. Then maybe what you want to do, and that's also like a good practice, is to sort of strip all of the elements and then selectively add color as you decide what it is that you're trying to highlight. So another way of displaying the exact same information, and instead using a bar chart, is basically by using your color to only highlight your business. And because all of the competitors are of secondary importance, you can use gray as a muted color. And of course, we're using the same principles that we saw before, where we're lining elements vertically and horizontally, so we can clearly tell these are the various categories and their labels. And another thing that we did here is that we ranked them. So we can see, for example, in the price category that our business is ranked 1 out of 6. And then we're going down and we can see that in the service and selection categories, our business is in the last position compared to the other competitors. So again, same type of information, just a much a lesser cognitive burden and an increased ease of conveying the point that we're trying to make. So how do you pick color? There's a few tools out there, and I'll summarize these at the end of the presentation. One that I like is called the Canva color wheel. And let me see. Yeah, okay. So basically, if you go on the canva.com/color/color wheel, you can pick whatever color you want, and you can choose a color combination. So let's say if you're only looking at 2 colors, then you can pick complementary, and whatever color you pick, it will give you the complementary color on that wheel. Same thing if you want more, then maybe you want the triadic, and it will give you the various color with the hex codes, and then you can export the palettes that you want. They also have a color palette tool, which I will link also at the end of the presentation. This is if you are looking for inspiration, you can just browse palettes that are already out there and use the colors that they put together for you. Sometimes you have an image already and you're interested in using the exact same colors in this image. So what you want to do in this case to extract this color palette is to use a specific tool. So one of them is called the Adobe Color Tool. It's free and online, but there's a bunch out there, and it will usually allow you to extract the color palette and to see the different codes, and also to play around, and if you want to add or remove a number of colors, you can do that as well. Another important consideration to keep in mind is how your data visualization product will look like to colorblind people who represent, I think, a little under 10% of the population. So I'm also linking a color blindness simulator, which is called Coblis. And if you essentially what you do is you upload your original image, and then you have on the website a bunch of different color blindness views, and you can see what your image would look like to a colorblind person. And I think this is a good it's a good practice, and it's good to keep in mind. So just to make sure that your data visualization is accessible to the greatest number of people possible. So now that we're through with this sort of basic primer on color, I just will I want to emphasize the point that color can be used in a strategic way. So it's a pre-attentive attribute, like we saw at the beginning of the presentation, right? And it's a way to convey information. Essentially, you want to leverage the fact that color carries information in and of itself, right? So with this map, this is work that's been done in Kenya that identifies where roadside crashes took place in Nairobi, in Kenya. Some of the crashes were reported on Twitter, and others were reported by the police. And this map is using color to show which crashes were identified by what tool. And Twitter, of course, uses blue as its main predominant color palette, and so you don't even need to spend too much time or attention just labeling what color is which, because you already know that Twitter is blue, and therefore you'll automatically make that bridge in your mind. If the colors were reversed, this would lead to confusion, and it would increase the cognitive burden as you're trying to process the information, and you have to remind yourself that actually the police is blue and Twitter is red. So instead, you want to use color in a way that makes sense, and we'll see another couple of examples in the rest of the presentation. This is the exact same map, and here instead we're using what's called a heat map. So again, this is a very logical way of thinking about color. Usually if something is red, we'll associate it with warmth, and if something is blue, we'll associate it with cold. And so we can use this spectrum to represent the intensity of the data amplitude, right? So for example, in this map, it's the same information as before, but instead we're clustering the crashes and we're saying wherever we have red dots, this is where most of the crashes happened. And wherever we have yellow, green, and blue dots, we have fewer crashes. So whereas before, using two colors will give you sort of points, individual data points, using a heat map will allow you to graphically represent the concentration of these crashes and to quickly identify where they tend to happen most often. Another way to use... Sorry, is there a question? Another way to use color is to take a color palette that's already out there in an official capacity. So this is a Sankey chart, and it's essentially a way to represent flows between usually different timestamps. So this one is about the UK general election in 2019 and how the various political parties won or lost seats. So here we're using the official party colors. The Conservatives are in blue, the Labour Party is in red, and so on and so forth. And you can see the Conservative Party winning seats, and you can see the Labour Party losing some and where the lost seats went, and so on and so forth. This is another example of using a corporate color palette. So this data set comes from the UN the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. And they were interested in the rent levels in 5 different regions in Lebanon. And they wanted specifically to know how the rents differed inside compared to outside refugee camps. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see their official color palette, which is in their brand guidebook. And here what we did is we tried to find color pairs that made sense in order to represent the same region on a vertical basis. So and also to show the inside versus outside camp on the horizontal basis. So the top row will be inside the refugee camps, the bottom row will be outside the refugee camps, and then each column will be a specific region. And we're using color strategically to essentially, by attributing a darker shade of the same color, to signify that it's the same region. One other alternative that we could have done if we wanted to emphasize the inside versus outside camp dimension instead of the region dimension is to just use 2 colors and have one color for the top row and a different color for the bottom row. Another point that I want to make with this visualization is that sometimes it's a little bit like what we saw with the column chart earlier. Sometimes it's easier to process your information if you split your graphs as opposed to if you have them all in the same graph. So if we had all of these lines on the same set of 2 axes, it would be quickly very overwhelming and we wouldn't be able to make out the varying, like the differences in the rent evolutions for each region. Another type of exotic graph, let's say, that I want to introduce here is the bubble chart. The bubble chart is a way to convey magnitude in a way which is cognitively easy, let's say. So the bigger the bubble, the wider the bigger the value. You can emphasize this by adding numbers, by adding labels directly inside the bubbles. So here, this is the same. It's the same data set of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and they were asked about the type of housing. And if you remember the previous chart, we're keeping the same dichotomy. So we have one row for inside the camp, one row for outside the camp, and then the vertical dimensions have to do with the actual regions. We're using the same official color palette. One thing to keep in mind is that when you have a lot of different variables and potentially a lot of different colors, what you want to do is you want to try and find colors that aren't too close to one another to highlight the contrast. So for example, you see that most of the people live in either apartments or independent houses. It would have been a little bit more confusing if we had picked, for example, red and orange, because the colors are so close, and instead we arranged the color palettes in a way that green and blue are the predominant colors, therefore thereby increasing the contrast. This is another bubble chart and another way of using colors. So instead of using a multicolor palette, instead here we're using varying shades of blue for the most part. So this data is about asking, again, the same group of Palestinian refugees, what kind of food groups they had consumed in the past week. So the frequency is on the x-axis, and the food groups are on the y-axis. So for example, if we take the oil and fat food groups, 35% of respondents said that they had eaten oil and fats 7 days out of the past week, and 18% said that they had only consumed it for 4 days in the past week. So we're using color here to emphasize which food groups are most consumed and which food groups are least consumed. And we can see that in the bottom in black, which is the darkest shade, 74% of respondents consume cereals, grains, roots, and tubers in the past 7 days, whereas 39% of respondents did not consume any meat, fish, and eggs at all, and almost half of them did not consume any fruit in the past week. So again, we're using color to emphasize the point. So in red is when you didn't eat any, you didn't consume any of that food group in the past week. And we're also using bubbles and labels to convey a sense of scale. And just essentially, it's a complicated data set to interpret in the first place. So if we can use these pre-attentive attributes and these Gestalt principles to facilitate the information intake, then it's time saved by the viewer, and we're making a stronger, more compelling argument. So let me focus on a different data set and sort of go back to the original format in which most of your data is going to come in at the very beginning. It's usually in the form of a table, right? But just because you have a table doesn't mean that you can't use data visualization principles to quickly identify attributes. So here what we have are different municipalities in Honduras. Each row is a different municipality. The first category are the identifiers, so the name of the municipality, the name of the department, and the associated code. In green, we have demographic indicators, so the population, NNA is the number of school children registered, and the percentage. In red are data that have to do with natural disasters, because Honduras went through tropical hurricanes. So we have the number of affected people, the number of schools that were affected by the hurricanes, the tropical storms. And then finally, the last group of the data has to do with COVID-19 cases, the incidence rate, and the hospital capacity. So if you imagine this table without any of these colors and attributes, it would take much longer to sort of quickly identify what is going on. But instead, this was done in Excel. So what we did is we used these different, so first of all, we assigned a different color for each category. And we also used the groupings on the tables just to separate the various the subcategories. And then we're using the color shades as pre-attentive attributes to highlight the outliers in the data set, right? So we can see that this municipality has a lot more people than the rest. We can see that these two have the lowest number of the lowest school enrollment rates, We can see which municipalities have the highest number of affected people by the tropical storms, and which municipalities have the highest number of cases, of COVID cases. And we assigned 3 different colors for the hospital capacity: high, medium, and low. And essentially, we're segmenting our data sets in a way that if we focus on a specific column where we added those attributes, we can make some quick takeaways. So this is usually what I like to do when I get a data set in table form, is just to play around with the colors in Excel and see if there are outliers that maybe I'll find later in the data. Sometimes you can combine different dimensions in the same graph. So this is the same data that I just showed in the previous slide. What we have are the proportion of students enrolled on the left axis, and we have the school enrollment rate. So you have the total volume of students enrolled on the left axis, and we have the actual enrollment rate, so the proportion, on the right axis. It can make sense to combine different dimensions in the same data set, in the same graph, sorry. You just need to make sure that you're using your pre-attentive attributes in a way that will make it clear which axis is referring to what indicator. So here, for example, in order to point to the fact that this line has to do with the right axis, I use the same color. And same thing here, I use blue to show that this axis refers to the proportion of students. So this was made on Flourish, and I'll just quickly show you the interactive capability of this tool, which I think are quite neat. So within each stacked column, we have different subgroups. So we have school children, or we have children rather, that are under 1 year old, children between 1 and 4 years old, children between 5 and 11, and children between 12 and 17. By clicking on the various categories, you can decide whether you want to, like which of the variables you're interested in. So for example, if you only care about children from 12 to 17, you can click on it. If you want to know 12 to 17 and 5 to 11, you can click on this, and so on and so forth. And maybe I'll show you, I think we still have time, so I'll show you directly on Flourish how to make these graphs quickly at the end of the presentation. But yeah, again, the similar elements on the graph that you want to always have are the axis labels, the titles, the legend, and so on and so forth. This is a different type of graph. It's called a radial graph, and this is a hierarchical graph. So what this means is that the information is divided in different levels. So what we represented here are the population per municipality. So you can think of it as a simple column graph that's just that we arranged in a circle form. This graph is just to essentially see how the municipalities are ordered by department. So each petal is a department, and then each of the individual column is a municipality. And you can sort of quickly see that in this particular department and in this particular municipality, you have this massive outlier. And this is essentially, if you go back to the table, this is actually the Distrito Central, which is the capital in the country. And then you can see that each of the department usually has a 1 or 2 bigger cities compared to the rest. You can click on the petal to sort of identify and zoom in on a specific department. And this is just a way to, again, quickly find out the outliers, which is usually what you're interested in when you're going through your data. So this same data, it's right now, like, we're using a lot of colors. It's not necessarily the most straightforward way to represent it, but let's say we're trying to figure out where to invest humanitarian assistance money, and we want to know which municipalities to focus on. maybe we can rearrange this data in a simple column chart. And here what we're doing is we're also using text to further drive a point. So we can see that this data set is particularly skewed. So we see these municipalities on the x-axis and the number of school children on the y-axis. We see these two outliers, which are the same ones here, like this big bar and this big bar. We see them again here. And what this graph is showing us is that 10% of the municipalities, they account for 50% of all school children. And we're using color, again, in a way that makes sense. So we're using the same color in the text as the color of the municipalities that we want highlighted in the graph. And this graph could be used to essentially make the point that if we focus on 10% of the municipalities, then we can potentially reach 50% of the children enrolled. So again, in an optic of wanting to make the most efficient use of financial resources. Another way of representing this data is by using a tree map. So this is essentially the same information of the amount of children. And each big square represents a department. Each smaller square represents a municipality. So what we're doing here is we're sort of visualizing how these municipalities of interest that we highlighted in the previous slide, so in blue, how they're distributed in the various departments and what kind of proportion they represent compared to the total population. So this total square is usually 100%, and then these will be the various individual municipalities. And this is also made on Flourish, and if you click on each of the various departments, you can zero in on each of them. And finally, so this is, again, the same data set, and here we're trying to make a point. We're trying to support the argument of saying which schools should reopen given the various COVID variables that are in the data set. So if you remember, we had the hospital capacity that was high, medium, or low, and we also had some COVID incidence rates that we grouped in 3 categories. And we're using a bubble graph, but on top of the bubble graph, we're using the enclosure principle that we saw earlier, as well as the color attributes. So we're showing that essentially in red, we have the municipality. So each bubble is a municipality. In red, we have the municipalities that have a low hospital capacity. So we're saying that we should probably keep those schools closed because if we were to reopen them and the cases were to skyrocket, the hospitals wouldn't be able to handle the increase in medical care required. However, the municipalities that have a medium and high capacity, medical capacity, we're saying are okay to reopen, and we're signifying, we're representing this okay by using a green enclosure around those municipalities. And group 1 is just the, I guess I could have put that in blue, but it's the first group of like the 10% of municipalities that represent 50% of the children. I chose to keep it in gray in order to sort of bring this level of information in the background and to not add unnecessary distraction, let's say. What we care about with this particular graph is who should reopen. We're saying those are the green ones, and who should stay closed. Those are the red ones. We don't need to add unnecessary details that may just confuse or increase the cognitive burden. Okay. So to summarize the various points that I made in this presentation, what you want to do when you're making your data visualization is to provide context so the audience knows what is the like what they're getting into. So if you think about the storytelling structure that we saw at the beginning, you want to have your introduction and just give a lay of the land. you want to keep your audience in mind as you're producing your data visualization. So do you care about talking about the exploratory phase or the explanatory phase of your data analysis? You want to choose an appropriate display based on the points that you're trying to communicate. You want to be mindful of color, so you want to avoid using an unnecessary amount of colors unless you have a very good reason to do so. And you want to keep it clean and legible. You want to have lined up elements. You want to use as much non-technical language as possible. You shouldn't assume that the audience knows as much as you do. And so in the avoid category, you have all of the opposite, right? You want to avoid clutter because it increases the cognitive burden. You want to avoid redundant information and unnecessary features. I'll talk about pie charts in a second, actually, but it's usually a bad idea. 3D as well is usually a bad idea. Why? Because you can represent the same information in 2D and it's usually simpler and cleaner. You want to avoid using garish colors, and you want to avoid complexity. So this is the very first data visualization that I talked about in this presentation. And I just wanted to highlight, now that we went over these basic visual principles and best practices, the reason why, some of the reasons why this graph is particularly popular and was quite revolutionary for its time, is because we're using so we're using color strategically, right? The beige shows the military campaign as it advanced towards Moscow, and the black shows the military campaign as it came back. We have a scale where I think each millimeter represents 6,000 men. So you can see the scale of the army at the beginning of the campaign compared to how many men came back after the various battles. You can see the various levels of the various layers of information that are superimposed. So at the bottom, you have a temperature chart where you have minus 26 degrees, and then it goes down to minus 30 and then minus 11. And you can see the temperature lines pointing to the various points during the campaign. And then finally, you can also see a geographic component with the various rivers, the various cities, and also text giving context, giving an introduction, giving like the dates and like the name of the author, who's an engineer called Charles Minard. And so all of this is essentially a lot of information that probably could have been laid out in a full essay, right? But instead, we're condensing it into just one simple chart that is fairly easy to apprehend, and that you can instantly sort of take them, like walk away with the scale of the human losses, which is ultimately what this graph is trying to communicate. Let me, since we have a little bit of time, I just want to go back to Flourish and show you what that looks like. So it's free to sign up. Usually you can, so let's say you want to create a new data visualization. You have all of these templates, right, that are organized in various categories. So these will be sort of the main classic ones, like the pie charts and the columns, etc. You have some maps. You have various scatter points. You have 3D maps, cards. You have heat maps as well, hierarchical graphs, line chart races, Sankey diagrams, chord diagrams, etc., etc. Like there's quite a few to go through, word clouds. And usually, once you've selected your display, so let's say we're going for a pie chart, it will show you what your graph will look like, and you have two views. You have the preview mode of visualization, and you have the data. And this is what I mean when I say it's very close to Excel. Essentially, you can go on Excel and copy paste your data here. You can play with the columns just as you would in Excel by copying, inserting a column left, right, removing rows, etc. and then you have the various labels, sorry, the various columns. You'll say, okay, this column are my labels, this column are my values, and so on. And then here you have the various parameters that you can control. For example, if you want to change the colors, if you want to change like the font size of the labels, you can play with all of those. One thing which is very good with Flourish is that it's easy to change the type of graph. So let me make a general point about pie charts. They're quite contentious in data visualization. Why? Because we're usually quite bad at making at understanding the size changes between the various slices of the pie, especially if you have a lot of slices. So for example, here, if you look at the data, the numbers actually go from 36,000 to 42,000. But if you just quickly look at the pie, it's really hard to say like which slice is bigger than the other, and then you need to go back to the legend and look at which color means what year, etc. So instead, what you might want to do is, for example, convert this into a simple bar chart where you just have the various years, and you can quickly see that in like 2009 it was a lot smaller than in 2017, right? You don't even need the colors, like these are the colors that we saw before. It's actually unnecessary information if you just use this bar chart, because the colors originally, they were there to identify the year, right? But if you just use the bar chart, you can quickly see this. So again, you can choose like which type of graph you want to use it. It's very quick, and it's very straightforward. If there's some interest, I could give like a dedicated session on Flourish, but I would recommend for you to just go on the website if you're interested, pick your data visualization template that you're interested in, and sort of play around, and very quickly you'll be able to produce something, I think. So let me just finish this presentation. I'll open the floor for questions and answer, but first I would like you to, I'd like to invite you to maybe apply some of the principles that we covered. And if you could tell me how you would improve. I just picked two different graphs that I selected from a World Bank paper. And I would love to hear what kind of feedback you have on this graph for starters, based on the principles that we covered. And thank you very much for your attention. And after those two examples, I'll open the floor for more general questions. Okay, I was just checking that people are still there. Let me, maybe since you guys are being a little bit shy, let me give you some quick takeaways on this graph. One way that we could make this graph a little bit more efficient, I think, is by, first of all, avoiding the use of a donut, which is a different type of pie chart. What's good here is that we actually have the labels directly on the slices, but maybe if we use the column chart or a bar chart, it'd just be easier to see the various, like the varying levels, right, that we're interested in displaying. Another thing that we could do with this graph is using color more strategically. So we want to ask ourselves, like, does it make sense to have different colors? And if it does, is there maybe a palette that would be a bit more harmonious? And then finally, an element that we can remove from this graph is just the background in gray, which is simply unnecessary, right? Because it doesn't add any information. that we're interested in, and it just sort of adds more visual clutter. Another graph that I found in the same paper is a column graph. So that's already a good start. But what we see in this one, it talks about the project types by implementing organization, is the overuse of color, right? It's very complicated to make out what color represents what kind of information. And there's a note at the end that has a lot of extra information that we shouldn't need to read about, that instead we should be able to take away just by looking at the graph with a right use of like color and labeling and so on and so forth. In the slide deck that I'll share, I also added some additional resources. So further reading, this is a book on data visualization where I got a lot of these principles from. Some R code for those who use R, the data visualization platform. So Flourish is the one that I use mostly for this presentation, but Data Wrapper and Infogram are also quite good and very user-friendly. Canva is a design platform. They also have the color wheel and the color palettes that I briefly talked about. The color extractor from Adobe, the color blindness simulator. And yeah, thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. And if not, oops. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Next question, like a quick question.
Yes.
It's in connection with Flourish. Like after getting your data or fixing all those colors and all that, what is the output? Does it come as PDF or TIFF or like the output?
So what Flourish does is that it will upload it on their own website. So you'll have a URL where essentially every time that I clicked, maybe I can show you quickly. Okay, I think you can see my screen. So every time this is basically what it gives, like the basic output. You'll have a URL, and when you go in the URL, you'll have that graph, which is dynamic, right? Based on like the information, the parameters that you have, you can play around with it. If you want it to be static, you can just take a print screen and like stick it in your reports. You can also host it if you have like a website, let's say, then you can host it directly on there. The free version of Flourish essentially means that your data is publicly accessible. So if you're working with sensitive information, let's say that you want to keep private, maybe you would consider using the paid version of the software and make sure that your data is not publicly available. But yeah, so you can export it as static, or you can host it on any kind of web output.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi, Marco. With regards to the maps, let's say if I pick a country like Ghana, how do I identify? Sometimes you have to know the longitudes and latitudes, and you know how to present the plot. Let's say I want to plot a number of schools in the various regions. Is it quite technical, or I can use Flourish to be able to do this easily?
So that's a good question. I haven't used the maps in Flourish. I think they're quite. You can do some stuff, but it's fairly limited. So Flourish will provide some templates. You can also like hard code from scratch if you know JavaScript. It's a library called D3. But in your particular case, I don't think that you'll be able to use Flourish for that. I think they have like an Africa template. I don't think they have a Ghana template. Usually, if you want to work with geographical data, you have to use what's called GIS, like Geographic Information Software. I think that's what it stands for. So the most common one is called ArcGIS. There are also some free versions of it. But the short answer is that yes, it's usually quite technical. There are ways around it. Sometimes if you're I'll try and find and like I'll include it in the slide deck if I find it, but it depends on the level of on like the administrative level that your data is on. So if it's like the country or the region or the department, the municipality level, I think there are some free tools out there that you can use and sort of color. But if you're trying to add like specific points, usually what most people do is they use ArcGIS or an equivalent GIS software. And in that case, yes, it is a little bit technical, and you do have to train yourself in order to have that kind of like flexibility of using, you know, like the various points and so on. If your data set is quite small, you can always just grab an empty map and sort of add the dots manually on like PowerPoint or Canva or Paint or whatever. But you're not going to have like an exact, like the same exactitude as you would as if you used a GIS software, in which case you just upload the data through your table and it will render the map for you, and you'll be able to sort of share this and like reproduce it. You know, this like the more like scientifically sound way. But if you're just making a quick presentation, then maybe you wanna do this manually. So yeah, it kind of depends on what you have and what you're trying to do and like how rigorous you want to be. But GIS can get a little bit technical, unfortunately. Yes.
Okay, let me be specific with this. So like we did a recruitment, and there was this. We tried to present a report on where each candidate, okay, the number of the regions each candidate came from. So we just want to know the regional distribution of candidates. So within the country, then we know that some are from the upper part of the region, some are from the southern part and all that. So like just to say, okay, this is Ghana, this is how the candidates came. There's a pictorial or an infograph of how the representation of the regions the candidates came from. Basically, something like that. Yeah, something like that.
I actually think you can do this for free in a fairly straightforward way. So I'll make a note from it. There's a tool I used in the past, but I can't remember what it's called, but I think I can find it for you.
Okay.
So let me make a note. Yeah, so basically, since you're at the regional level, it's a fairly it's like it's within, there's usually 3 admin levels, right? And I think the tool that I have in mind allows you to sort of zero in, and what you can do is you can pick your color.
Okay.
Sometimes like using a map is not necessarily the most straightforward way of going about it, right? Like maybe you can show this exact same information using like a bar chart or a column chart or even a pie chart, something simple. But it's true that having a map is usually quite nice, and it's a very like, you know, like
Exactly.
right? So no, there are usually, I think in your particular case, it's simple enough. Then the free tools online should be enough. So let me try and find what I have in mind, and then I'll just add it in the slide and share that with you guys.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do we have more questions?
Doesn't seem like it. I hope it's because it was super clear and not super boring. Thank you for your attention, and I see that the attendance has risen as well during the presentation, so that's really nice. I'll share the slide deck and my contact information. If you have specific questions, please feel free to reach out. You can always get in touch by email or on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to assist you however I can. So yeah, thanks again for your attention, and thank you for the team for organizing this workshop. It was a pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Marco. if anyone has questions, once again, please feel free to email us, any of us, and we'd be happy to answer those questions. Yeah, thank you so much, Marco, for your time today, and we will probably continue with